So I was brought up in a kinship arrangement and had a very chaotic early bit of my life, really. I've got very chaotic mum, very chaotic grandma, great grandma. So I was born into a situation which was basically 3-4 generations worth of traumatised women. I don't have a lot of memory in terms of I can't remember periods. I can't go, well, this happened and this happened. But what I have got is some really key bits. So I remember I'd have been about 6, and I remember being really distressed, and I remember biting myself. And I guess, in hindsight, that would probably have been sort of my first experience of self-harm. And I was covered in bruises, and I remember my gran grabbing hold of me, not quite by the hair, but not far off, and going, "You've got to stop doing that, do something else instead." And I don't know what happened after that. I've got nothing else, but I remember that really clearly. And I remember my mum used to be around, so she lived with us to begin with, and then moved out. And I'd probably, I don't know, 3, 4 maybe when she moved out, but she still kept coming back. And when she came back, it started every weekend, and then, it's a common story, innit? It becomes once a fortnight, once a month, a couple of times a year. And I remember I'd been to visit her, and I came back, and again, I was really distressed. I'd probably be about 8, maybe 9 by this point. And I was hyperventilating. And my gran took me to the doctor and told the doctor that I had asthma. And again, in hindsight, I remember being treated for asthma. In hindsight, I didn't have asthma. What I was actually having was a panic attack. But what became was, it's a physical problem, we'll move on, that sort of thing. And there's lots of little experiences, little sort of like snippets of words that repeat and have repeated throughout my life, really. And even to this point, I'm seeing 49 on Monday, and it's still there. I can still hear those words, and there's lots of variations of that sort of through my life. And I moved out at 16 because I just knew I needed to get away. Absolutely needed to get away from that situation. And I moved into a house which was run by an organisation called Gyroscope, who are, they just rock the world. They are a bunch of hippies and folks that don't really fit, that sort of thing. And I moved into one of their houses, and it was a project where people were, it was people that were signing on, that sort of stuff. And it was a collective. So you got subsidised rent for working either in like the shop type, co-op type arrangement, or on their sites. Because what they do is buy houses really cheaply. This is sort of early 90s. Buy houses really cheaply. You can still buy a house in Hull for about 10 grand at that point, and then do them up, and then rent them out to people. So it sort of grew and grew and grew, and it still exists actually as a major organisation. But they had about 4 houses at that point. So I was a 16-year-old girl who was running away, and I moved into a room, with a bunch of blokes. They were all in their 30s, and life changed. And I remember me granddad showing up and putting a lock on my door, because it must be because they wanted to take advantage. And actually that bunch of blokes showed me that life didn't have to be how it had been. They treated me differently than how I'd been treated previously. So sort of some around sort of 6 to maybe 10. Then we've got a little bit around 16. And I remember I was in that house, and they were all at something or other, and I wanted to fit in, I wanted to belong. I was 16 and I was busy being, I can do this, and I guess that was my introduction to Class A drugs. I guess I'd come across bits and pieces before that, but and weed had always been a thing. But in terms of actually, a powder, a substance that we'd recognise as a habit, then that's probably where that started. And I lived with them for about 4 or 5 years. And what I learned really quickly was that there was a lot of stuff that made me feel better. Amphetamines were my drug of choice, I guess. Not that we really have one, but It was my drug of choice. But then I was up in the north. I was in Hull, and it was everywhere. You know, it was that time. It was that period in history, I guess. You know, that's what we did. You know, speed to go up, and either weed or a bit of smack to come down. That's what, you know. It's all about balancing the chemicals, isn't it? And I remember one day that I'd collapsed on the stairs because I wasn't eating very well. I wasn't, you know, I just wasn't taking care of myself very well by this point. And I collapsed on the stairs, and I remember thinking, if I stay here, I'm going to die. And I moved out 2 days later, and moved into another house because I've never really had roots in that sense. You know, I never felt that my family was my roots. I didn't have a home in that sense. So I've always been able to just up myself and move somewhere else because I ain't got anything to lose, nothing to leave behind really. And so I upped sticks and moved. And I registered in uni because I had done my A-levels. I bombed them a bit, but I'd done enough to be able to get in through clearing a couple of years later. And I went to uni. And that changed it all again. I mean, I still say now education is a difference. If I hadn't have had education, I wouldn't be sat here now. It changed my entire world. I have to say I bombed out of uni the first time because I was still pretty chaotic. So I managed 8 weeks and then went back to, you know, where I'd come from basically. Didn't let go of the room. I knew that I needed that, but you know, it's not quite that easy, is it? And then started getting sort of involved with sort of folks around university, folks around this house that I'd moved into. I'm still friends with one of the women that were in that house actually to this day. But what I found instead of speed was booze, which of course also makes you feel a damn sight better at the beginning. So I had a period of where booze was a sort of a real focus. Again, not very long, probably about 18 months, something that sort of that period. And then I met my first husband, and we were out clubbing because that's what we did, you know. And I was very drunk and I didn't fancy walking home in the dark, so I went and grabbed the first bloke who I could find that answered the question yes when I said, "Do you have a car and are you sober?" And he drove me home and didn't leave. And that's sort of been a theme. So I spent 6 years with him. Again, speed was still a bit of a thing. Booze became less of a thing, largely because I'm a little woman and it's really hard to maintain it. And physically, you know, I've always been quite functional, really, but physically it was hammering me. I had stomach problems, and you know, it was making me ill. So, and actually, substances for me have always been about making me feel better, and so I stopped doing the things that made me feel ill and went back to the things that made me feel better, you know. And again, it's always been that balance. And then finished uni, so I did go back for a second go, and I finished it, and I qualified, and I had basically transferred my passion a little bit there, because I went and did a social work masters, which had an addictions module. I knew that drugs, alcohol, changing the way you feel, all of that stuff, I knew that's where my interest was. I knew that there was something there. So I went and did an addiction module that sort of looked at, you know, abstinence is key and all of those sorts of things. And on qualifying, I moved over to West Yorkshire. And whilst we were there, my granddad died. That was a massive, pivotal one. Because he was almost like an anchor in the middle of all these chaotic women. And when he went, the rest of my family shattered. So I'm in my early 20s by this point, and realised that I absolutely didn't want to be in West Yorkshire. So again, up sticks and moved. Going back actually made me feel more displaced than if I'd stayed away, because all of these arrangements were happening for my granddad's funeral, and it was a weird time because I'd always been brought up. I always knew they were my grandparents, but my gran wanted my aunts to treat me as a sister, including my mum, and they couldn't. They absolutely couldn't. You know, it just went against, and it caused loads and loads of fractures. But my dad sort of was like the pin in the middle of it. My granddad, I should say. And the minute that pin was pulled, the world just sort of shattered apart. And around that time, I met a man who, again, changed my life. There's a bit of a theme about men changing my life here, isn't there? That has changed. I have to say that's changed with age. But a man who absolutely changed my life. He was, well, he claimed to be in recovery at the time. He wasn't, actually. There was a little bit of 13th stepping going on there. But 13th stepping, it lasted 20 years. So, you know, I'll take that. But he was in recovery, really ardently in recovery as well, really sort of just everything was about that, you know, and about him not doing it. And he introduced me to things like NA and AA. And I did spend some time in NA, not AA, because as I say, you know, stimulants and weed were far more of an issue for me at that point. But he spent a lot of time telling me I was hanging on for dear life, that I was white knuckling it, and I really resented it because I was white knuckling some things. I absolutely was. You know, don't most of us through our 20s and 30s. It's a thing, isn't it? You know, but I didn't understand. It didn't fit for me. Yeah, I was white knuckling something, but it wasn't what he thought it was. He thought it was about staying clean and sober, but it never was. It was always, for me, about staying stable, which is a different sort of, you know, working through of it, I guess. You know, his theory was as long as he didn't use drugs, everything would be all right. And my experience was, as long as I didn't use drugs, I would never be all right. And I'd spent some time, you know, I've spent some time in therapy over the years. I've, you know, been a psychiatrist, all of those sorts of things. And I've tried most of the traditional various sort of, you know, the mood stabilizers, antidepressants. They've had me on amitriptyline. I was on Haldol at one point, you know. And what I found with all of that was that it just made it worse. The drugs make it worse. And so I was sort of stuck in this sort of really raw place of where and what. And when this man that changed my life, he got diagnosed with cancer about 8 years ago, and died shortly after that. And at that point, I went, fuck it. You know, I just need to get through this. I need to be all right. I need to be, you know, my husband, who I absolutely loved desperately, was dying, and I was watching it happen, and there's nothing I could do, and I cannot get through this and stay okay. And so I basically picked up weed again at that point. Now, I'd not used anything for a good few years by this point. We're up to early 40s. I'm just skipping over my 30s there. And I just needed the world to not hurt because I wasn't able to function. So I had to look after this dying man who was becoming less like my husband and more like a shadow, I guess, whilst making sure that, you know, I could still pay the mortgage and the dogs were still getting fed, and, you know, the people that worked for us, because we'd set up a business in 30s, you know, that they were okay, because of course everyone's got families and kids, and the pressure was just immense. And I went and got some weed, and the world got better. And that was really, really pivotal, because I suddenly went, hang on a minute, why have I tried to not, what have I been doing? What have I been hanging on for dear life for? What is all of this about? And he was saying, you know, sort of in those last moments, because he was desperately trying not to take painkillers, because he felt that if he took the morphine, it had meant that he'd relapse. And it made me so angry. I mean, just so angry, because he was, you know, he lost 11 stone. You know, he was just a skeleton at the end. And he went through the pain because society told him that if he took the drugs, he'd relapse. You know, it's like, I had 2 years left. Fuck it, take the drugs. You know, why is it that pain is almost expected because of social expectations of what is and what isn't? And that was pivotal. And I'm skipping about here a bit, which I'm sort of going in a timeline. And then the next one, I did lose him. We gave him the funeral he deserved and all of that, And I still say to this day, I wouldn't change that for the world. Absolutely wouldn't repeat it today. The start of our relationship was built in manipulation, was built in, sort of some of that. It was pretty toxic early days. That changed, and he changed, and we changed. And as I say, I absolutely wouldn't change any of it. But sitting here today, what it taught me, I guess, and what I've learnt since from a couple of other bits, is that what the world says and what the reality is aren't the same thing. So he died, I say, we buried him, and we cremated him, rather. He'd have been so upset if we'd buried him. But, and he's still a major part of me. I spent 20 years with him. I was in my early 20s when we got together. I was in my early 40s when he died. That's, it's my formative adult years, really, isn't it? So he's absolutely still here. But what it taught me was what I didn't want. And I carried on smoking from that point. And actually, I got more and more functional. And some of that was recovery from the grief process, absolutely. But I suddenly realised that I was a survivor in my own right. And actually, why were people defining me based on what I did or didn't do? And so I carried on smoking, and I carried on working, and I rebuilt. I found a new relationship. I rebuilt. I absolutely rebuilt. And then we got to this point where I married my new relationships. Very, very happily married these days. What I found there was a partner rather than something that defined who I was going to be. What my late husband did was defined what I was based on what was in his head. And so what I ended up doing was chameleoning based on what he needed. And a combination of that sort of shifting, obviously, as he got ill and died, and me going, actually, I'm a lot more stable when I'm doing this as opposed to that, and sort of coming to terms with that was pivotal, I guess. The next one and the last one happened about 4 years ago. And so I remarried. So I married Russ, my husband now, and we invited a load of our friends and family and staff members to the wedding, and we had a do. And one of the members of staff saw me smoking at the wedding, and then when I tried to challenge her some months later, she reported me for being a drug addict. And I'm sat going, hang on a minute, what? Am I? What? And I suddenly went, we're here again. We're absolutely here again, And for quite a long time, because I ended up being suspended and investigated and all of that sort of stuff. No case to answer, because actually at no point had I been impaired. No point, No point had I actually done anything other than, running a decent business and being a decent human being, really. And at that point, I went, no, not enough. I've had enough. And I actually, I went private. And I really resented going private because I've got some really deep-rooted values around socialism and shared healthcare and all of those sorts of things. But what I realised was that if I wanted to continue to manage my own mental health, my own emotional state, then the only way I could do that was with a doctor. And I went to the doctor. And they basically, they look at all of the things that you previously tried. And, I've been a walking, rattling pill pot for donkey's years. My first diagnosis was at about 7 years old with attachment disorder. I've had about 3 or 4 since then, and also a couple of physical health conditions. I've got complex PTSD, depressive disorder, generalised anxiety disorder, and if you put me in front of an ADD test, I'll probably, well, I know I'm off the scale on that as well. You know, and it's like all of those things are going on, and if I smoke, I can have a life. Who is society to tell me that I'm not, that I'm a drug addict, that I'm you know? And a medic agreed with me. So I talked to the medic, you know, and I'm now prescribed both oil and flour via a legal term. Am I doing anything different that I've been doing, you know, sort of over the last sort of decade while I've been managing it? No. All I've got is a script. That's the difference. So that's quite pivotal as well, because what it says to me is that addiction is socially defined. You know, if I take prescribed the drugs, I can't. I mean, I've had things that have made me dribble. You know, things that have made me have Parkinsonian shakes. You know, I've got quite severe problems in my ears and things like that. Which a balance disorder is one of the physical conditions I've got. So all of that stuff, all of those things that impact on your brain chemicals, they just make me zone out, or they make me manic, or they make me, my decision making is impaired, and I can't, you know, sort of link things together. But if I smoke weed or I take some oil, I'm not in pain, and I can have a life. So for me, that's the definition of recovery. You know, 12 steps say to us is a bridge to normal living. You know, I'm sat here in a nice village with a roof over my head, with people around me that I like. You know, that's pretty much recovered, isn't it? I think there's huge problems, actually. I think society defines recovery. I don't think the individual does. And I think that's one of its conflicts, because I think over the years, you know, there's been so much talk about recovery, and you know, this is recovery and that is recovery, and all of that sort of stuff. And it's always located with the individual. You know, the individual has to stop taking drugs. The individual has to build social capital. You know, you have to, you know, go and re-engage with your community. But that's not how the world works. The definition of recovery is abstinence, and that's not recovery. That's abstinence. You know, clues in the name, really. You know, taking a substance away doesn't solve the problem for most people. You know, yes, for some people, you know, they just get into, it's a bit too much and it's physical and they just need a bit of help to get off, and you know, absolutely. But actually, when we're talking about what the world calls addicts, you know, that's not it, because the substance and the abstinence is a symptom of whatever it is the struggle is. The struggle is about changing the way you feel, because actually you feel grim and you can't get through the day because of that feeling, whether that's a sense of dread, whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's an existential crisis about, well, what are we all here for anyway? You know, and there's loads of theories about, you know, how some people might feel emotions more intensely, or, you know, can't cope with it as well. You know, it's all individually located. But actually, for me, when I took away the substance, it got worse, not better. And, you know, there were loads of people sat thinking, well, she can't have left it long enough then, you know, hasn't been abstinent long enough, you know, and all of those sorts of stuff. You know, I mean, I was completely abstinent for about a decade at one point. Life didn't get better. So how long do I have to wait? Because actually, you know, that's a fifth of my life at this point that I was just plain miserable and in pain. Is that recovery? Because I couldn't go out, I couldn't do stuff, you know. My relationships were all over the place. My ability to pay the bills were all over the place. You know, I remember going to the post office and cashing checks, not knowing that they were going to bounce, you know, and all that sort of stuff. You know, the house got foreclosed on, and, you know, I mean, life just fell apart. I was drug free. Was I recovered? No. Was I Ella's like? Did I have social capital? No. None. Because you can't go and gain social capital People give it to you. Society gives it to you and says that you are a productive member of this society. And for the society to say that, you have to tick these boxes. So you have to take antidepressants rather than cannabis. You have to take antipsychotics rather than heroin. Well, why? Antipsychotics, for example, completely mess up your physical system. You're more likely to die of heart attacks and, respiratory problems and, all of those sorts of things. Yes, there's massive risks with heroin. I'm not saying that everyone should do that instead at all. But diamorphine is one of the most benign substances there is. It's the lifestyle and the stuff it's cut with that damages people, and the emotional damage of living outside, not belonging, because you're using a drug. But if it's a prescribed one, that's okay. That's a social definition. That's not an individual definition. Yet if somebody relapses, so if I relapse, it's an individual problem. But I've relapsed because life isn't better when I do that, And is it a relapse if you're making a choice? Society tells me, would tell me that it isn't. I'm saying society is just plain bloody wrong. So I think that's part of the conflict. We're all told that it's an individual definition. We go into services and all of those sorts of things. And in my early 20s, I did spend some time in services. I remember a GP trying to detox me off speed with DFs. Like, what? Give me opiates to make me feel better from stimulants. It's like, why is that better? What is that about? And it's about power. It's about authority. And that one my most recent pivotal moment that I was mentioning, where I was called out and reported. I am a registered professional. I'm still a registered professional. I actually, when I got reported, I resigned my profession, which was a major blow. I mean, major, because that was a big chunk from an identity point of view. That it defined who I was. It was me. I'd earned that. Nobody could take it away. And then suddenly someone took it away because I'd smoked weed at my wedding. How is that all right? So it's, was I more recovered because I'd been reported, and I might go into rehab. So well, actually, if you look around, I've paid tax for 30 years. I've been in a professional role for 30 years. I've written 9 textbooks. I'm a fellow in 2 universities. I run my own business, and as an SME earner, I've run it for 15 years. I'm a contributing member of society. No one can say I'm not. I think it can mean whatever you want it to. And I think that sort of links to the idea of social diagnosis when we were talking about mental health as well. Am I an addict in social terms? Absolutely. Absolutely am. Have been since probably about 9 years old when my mum gave me a fag. Great parenting. But is it a negative? No, not necessarily, would be my view to that. Because, an addict has got skills. We forget that because we talk about addiction as if it's about abstinence. But actually, the amount of effort it takes to keep yourself well is really hard work. And if you can find a different way to do that, a different way to use it, a different way to that doesn't make you unwell, then I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the problem we have is that you're either an addict or an ex-addict. You're a user or you're not a user. And that's how it's defined, I think if you can spin that a little bit. I mean, what I did learn was that for me, I'm an addict, or drug dependent, or whatever, the terms have been over the years. It's only ever an issue when you're causing a problem from a social point of view, when you can't afford it, effectively. or your physical health can't cope with it, or whatever it is that's happening around you. The actual idea of being an addict, I think, could be a much more positive thing. Because if we look across, all sorts of sectors, and where addiction type behaviour, because it's compulsive behaviour, it's that drive, and if you're doing something socially acceptable, then that's a good thing. It's celebrated. If you're doing something that society sees as bad, then you're a junkie. I know that's an unpopular term, but Bukowski put it on paper, so I'm going to use it. I like it. So for me, I absolutely identify with it. I identify with the behaviours of it. I identify with the ideas of that compulsion. I do buy into some of the concepts from some of the models. So that idea of one is too many, 1,000 never enough, for example, from our 12-step colleagues. I absolutely see that. I recognise that. But I recognise it in certain substances. I don't recognise it as a catch-all. I think if you're going to individualise recovery, then you have to individualise recovery. So for me, there's substances that I absolutely would not go near because I don't like either what it does to me or the after effects, and they would never be, well, I never say never, but, they're not on the table, haven't been on the table for, I say, nearly 30 years now, so. But there's substances that make things better. And I think that's the key thing. I mean, that 10 years that I spent absolutely substance-free, I mean, even down to caffeine at one point, completely squeaky clean. I was so miserable and ill for most of it, because I was still in pain. I was still in it, the distress didn't go away. It was like my soul was ragged through most of it. I was hanging on for dear life, and I think I mentioned before, my late husband used to say I was hanging on. I didn't know what I was hanging on for. What I was hanging on for was actually trying to find meaning of the world, trying to find belonging, trying to find where did I fit, what did I do, what happens when everybody around you tells you you don't fit? What happens when from the earliest age you can remember, you're told that if it wasn't for me, you'd be in a care home. This is 70s, early 70s and forced adoption sort of period of time. If that's the message, you're never going to be good enough. You're always going to be less than, which are really key things from an addict personality point of view. Then actually what happens when you take the drug away and you're still less than? You go, well, actually, none of that was true, was it? None of that was true. I'm clean, but I want to scratch my own skin off. So rage quitting was a thing for me. But I can still, even today, a sharp trauma reaction will send me howling to the moon. The difference today is I know what it is. And I guess that links back to things like education. I actually looked at addiction. I did my social work qualification was focusing on addiction, and I did my dissertation was on risk behaviour and why people engage in risk behaviour. And there's so much of that I was looking at and thinking, you engage because you want to be part of, and actually addiction is about belonging somewhere. It's about finding your tribe. It's about, yes, we're often socially anxious and all of those sorts of things, but we need people. We all need people. We need to be accepted. We need someone to love us, because otherwise what's the meaning of life? If we haven't got that, what we got? We're born, shit happens, you die, So I think addiction is something that's viewed negatively. I don't think it has to be. I think we're a long way from championing the addicts. I really do. But I think that's what we should be doing, because there is some seriously productive, smart people out there. You don't get into the land of overthinking, which, let's face it, is where a lot of the pain comes from, and that conditioning and overthinking from the formative years. If you're not interested in the world, you shut it out, you carry on. and we might call it emotional intelligence, but actually it's about emotional survival sometimes, isn't it? And for some of us, that needs cushioning because life is just too harsh without. I guess it's about where you put that. So the world would define me as an addict. Yeah, absolutely. I'm okay with it. I can live with it. I probably am. Doesn't mean it has to be negative. I can do something with that. Diagnosis generally. Okay, let's start with that. I think it's horses for courses, actually, is what I think. I think for some people it makes the world make sense. Some people, I think it gives them an excuse to cop out of the world. For some people it a bit of both, maybe. It controls the whatever the distress is. I think it's pseudoscience. And that's actually based on 30 years of working in mental health as well as experiencing mental health issues. It can be really helpful because it gives us access. That's one of the key things and one of the real struggles. Because if you haven't got a doctor giving you a diagnosis, then you don't get access to the support you might need. So I think it depends on what sort of support you need, how severe your impairments are, or how severe your distress is, how it's contained, so who have you got around you, and all of those sorts of things. And for some people, it's vital. For me, I think it's had moments where it's been really helpful. And I remember someone saying to me, or saying about me rather, well, they haven't got any conditions. And I remember thinking, I think you'll find I've got a list. So there's certainly, and that was quite a sort of empowering thing to do at the time. And so I think there's been moments where it's been really helpful for me, because it's validated that experience. I spent a lot of time not being sure whether it was real or not, whether, my snatches of memory or my, how I experienced different things, was it me? And because of the relationship that I was in, it suited my late husband for it to be in my head because he had a narrative all of his own. And I think it's actually been equally harmful and helpful for me, actually, over the years, depending on different contexts and who, what relationships and what I needed out of it. In terms of what resonates, the one that I absolutely believe, because I think it's which ones do I believe more than which ones resonate. The one that I believe is the attachment disorder. I absolutely accept that to be true. It's there. I've got massive disorganised attachment, and it's coloured my relationships throughout my life. So that one I'm happy with. I'm comfortable with. I actually have an inner voice, as most of us do, but being a little bit chaotic in my head, I have a whole internal monologue going on, and the voice of my internal monologue I call attachment chick. So I've sort of almost conceptualized that diagnosis, I guess, but that understanding of that pain. But I also accept that it's a label, and is that what's really going on, and where does that interface with other elements? So, I mean, my collection, as I say, is quite wide. But if you look at them, there's so many crossovers, and so much of it is self-report. So it depends on both what you're describing and what the person you're describing it to is receiving. So if you go to, if I went to a trauma specialist, they would tick trauma. If I go to a psychiatrist, they will probably tick personality disorder, because catch-all. If I went to an autism specialist, I'd probably, end up ADD type, because actually I do tick all of those boxes. I do have periods where I'm completely hypomanic,
In my youth, I used to do practical things like strip the wallpaper and things like that. These days, you know, physically, physically I can't do it anymore. So I find other ways to do it, which are far more cerebral. But you know, it's absolutely a form of mania. But is that a mania because of the attachment disorder? Is it a mania because I'm having a trauma response? The concept of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, absolutely, you know, I think that resonates, that makes sense to me. And because I still to this day have trauma responses that are not really based on anything. You know, I know that I'm not at threat, but my body is telling me that I am. You know, what I'm better at now is recognizing it so I don't then end up, you know, in situations that bring me to the attention of the outside world, really, you know. Again, I have the luxury and the privilege of being able to go and lock myself in the bathroom, you know, as if I was a 12-year-old again, you know. Not everybody's got that, you know. What you see is with people that with that level of trauma and chaos, you know, whatever you call it, does it matter, really? You know, if you think you're going mad, then yes, it matters. You know, if you're looking at yourself and going, actually, that's part of me, and actually, if I took that away, who would I be? Which I think is the place where I've now got to. Then it matters less. You know, I guess I don't object to them. You know, so they've been really helpful in places, and I think some people do need them. Absolutely. Do I? Definitely the attachment one. I think that one, because I've built it, but that's because I've built it into how I see the world and how I manage the world. You know, if I'm having a reaction that isn't a grown-up reaction, then it's attachment check. You know, I know that's me. You know, absolutely. It's not, you know, I'm not having a multiple personality moment or anything along those sorts of lines, but it's a form of dissociation, I guess. It's a form of separation. But it makes me functional. You know, it means that I don't rage quit anymore. I had a great line in rage quitting in the first chunk of my career. I went through 4 jobs in the first 6 months of qualifying. You know, you can't sustain that over a lifetime and still have a career, can you? You've got to find a way to manage it, or you put yourself back in the dole queue, you know. And I knew I didn't want to be in the dole queue. Today, as in today, I know that's not the question, that's been a bit concrete, but I'm having a day off. Excuse me. Which is the first day I've had in a while, actually. I run a business. I work with my mates and my husband from the bottom of the garden. And it's thriving, and we're doing some really good stuff. Is life always simple? Of course it's not. You know, an attachment disorder, and here are all of these things too. Of course it's not. You know, I can be an absolute nightmare. I am contrary and stroppy and, you know, and demanding and all of those sorts of things. And I've got some massive blind spots, you know. Difference today is that I know that they're there. And actually, without some of those things, what I've got now wouldn't be possible. And I think two things about that. One is sort of linking back to my late husband. You know, despite all of his flaws, because he had many, he taught me how to love. He taught me how to trust. And he taught me that actually you can attach to somebody and they won't necessarily go away. You know, because in the same breath as me saying I wouldn't have changed it, I don't think he would have done either. You know, he left because he had no choice. But what it allowed me to do was start again. And not by divorcing myself from my past, not at all. You know, I've sat here with you for the last couple of hours, you know that, you know. It is part of who I am, but it doesn't define who I am. Or at least it doesn't define who I want to be and who I, you know, yeah, where I want to go. I don't think I still know what I want to be when I grow up. You know, I don't. But I do know that I've got some seriously good people around me. And I've learned how to live with my own quirks, and I've learned how to use them. And I've learned that cannabis helps me to do that. And I've reconciled that in my head. I would describe myself as recovered today, sat here in front of you. I absolutely would. Society wouldn't. But, you know, I'm nearly 50. Society can do one at this point. Will I be able to maintain that for however many years I've got left? Probably not, because I'm chaos. But I know what it is now, you know. So education changed the world for me. And that's never stopped, you know. If I get new responses to things now, new symptoms, you know, or a new area of distress or something I'm not sure, I don't run away from it anymore. I go and have a look and poke around. And I know it might make it worse in the immediate term, but it then means I can do something different. You know, I remember all the way through, ooh, this is something really positive came from treatment. That's quite an interesting reflection, actually. But people used to say, do things differently. And I never knew what that meant. You know, you've just got to do it differently. Well, what do I do? Give me a script. You know, at this point, you know, I've had so many losses in my life, you know, whether that's, you know, loss of that maternal love at the beginning, the loss of my family, the loss of, you know, my husband I spent 20 years with. I lost my womb in my early 30s. So, you know, things like having children was never on the cards for me. So, and it just continued and continued until I realised that, of course, it continues because that's what life is. And actually, each one of those changes something. You know, it's an opportunity, I guess. It's silver lining. You know, that doesn't mean that life's always easy, because it really isn't. You know, there is days where, you know, I still want to pull my skin off. But what I've got now is something that I can both function on, and I've got a doctor that says it's okay, and I can carry on doing good stuff with the people that I like. And I don't, you know, I'm not spiritual particularly. I've never been religious. I you know, I think organised religion is just the root of most evil, to be perfectly honest. But, you know, life is about living it, I guess. You know, whether you see it as Bridgeton living, whether you see it as doing it differently, whatever it happens to be. And from the point of losing my late husband, and then, as I say, recognising that all these people were saying I was an addict. But how can you reconcile those two things, you know? And it doesn't work. It's a massive conflict. So therefore it can't be true, can it? It can't be real. And it's just about redefining that, I guess. So I don't know. I don't know if I've got any major direction. I know that we're doing decent stuff, you know, and everybody's happy doing that stuff. And that's enough, really.